Hello, everybody. I think we're ready to get started. I'm sorry to interrupt your great conversations. It's terrific to see so many people here. Welcome to the 2019 Environmental Conference put on by Pitt Law's Energy Law and Policy Institute, as well as our environmental program. I'm Amy Wildermuth. I am the Dean at Pitt Law, and it is such a great thing to have this event today. I know it's a little chilly out there. I'm so glad that all of you made it into this warm space. Now, I have to say, having moved from Utah, I'm used to the day where it will warm up right as the sun is out. I have to say, yesterday we had that interesting phenomenon once again here in Pittsburgh where it got colder through the day. I'm still trying to figure that all out. But I have to say we have great speakers, and you are in for a real treat. In our group of speakers today, what you will notice is that we have tried to pick some of the very hottest topics in environmental law to talk about. And we brought in these great folks to join us to give some perspectives on these topics. Those three topics that we have panels on: urban water planning, environmental justice, and the Pennsylvania Environmental Rights Amendment, are truly some of the most timely topics that you will see out there. We're still trying to figure out these issues, and that's why today is such an exciting day to have everybody join us in this conference. We also have a great talk on something very near and dear to my interests, energy law, that's going to come up in just a second. It'll kick us off, I think, in a really great direction. But part of my job is to make sure that we thank everybody who put this conference together. So none of this would be possible, of course, without the hard work and the efforts of the Pitt Law team. And I'm going to thank a few people. I'm going to have them stand up. They're going to be panelists later on, but I'm going to have them stand up. I'd like Grant to stand up over here, Josh and Meryl Lee, and then Lauren, who's in the back. I'm going to have Mickey and Audrey stand up. If you could join me in thanking them, they are responsible for everything that we are pulling off today. So thank you so much. We started planning for this back in the fall, and it has just been a terrific experience. Now, what I also have to say is that we'd be nowhere without Kevin Abbott's terrific leadership of the ELPI since 2015. As many of you know, Kevin has taught for us at Pitt Law for quite some time, but he also has one of the most interesting practices out there. He does energy law and, of course, the natural combination with media law. Who does that? He might be the only one in the country. I'm not sure. I think so, right? So he has maintained that practice, all while helping us at Pitt Law to grow our presence in energy and environmental law. I cannot thank Kevin enough for all he has done, so I hope you will join me in thanking him and welcoming him so that he can introduce our keynote speaker.
Thanks very much, Dean. I would like to echo the Dean's comments, thanking the Pitt staff for putting it on, Lauren, Mickey, Audrey, and Kim making sure that the microphones and everything works. So thanks very much. It's my pleasure and my privilege to introduce our first speaker. We're very lucky to have with us Professor Monika Ehrman from the University of Oklahoma College of Law. She also teaches at the business school there, and also she's the leader of their energy program. Monika, I got to know through both of our membership in the Rocky Mountain Mineral Law, and she's a very interesting and dynamic speaker. She had a career, she has worked in-house. She's been a general counsel for an energy company. She grew up on the plains of Western Canada, so oil and gas is in her blood. I was complaining to her last night at dinner about my long commute to Washington County, and she told me that in Western Canada, she would drive 4 hours just to say hey to a friend. So, and she now commutes from Dallas to Oklahoma to go to work. So nobody here probably has a longer commute, and we're very privileged to have her here. She has a background in petroleum engineering, so she actually knows the science, and she definitely knows the law. And so I'm going to welcome Monika Ehrman to speak.
Can everyone hear me okay? It's all right? All right. Well, thank you, Professor Abbott, for that lovely introduction, and thank you to Professor Galper and Professor Abbott for the invitation to speak to you today, and to everyone at Pitt Law for your hospitality, your organization. I've had the opportunity to visit with some incredibly bright and brilliant students, and so it's a real privilege to be here. So I think that's really interesting that Professor Abbott started off talking about commutes, because that's how I wanted to start off. When we think about what we use energy for, we think about it with really what the two most, sort of the greatest uses for United States consumption of energy is. Transportation, and today, because it's cold outside, electric power generation. And so the idea of the commute is really where I want to begin the story of energy and why it's so fundamental and should be a component of human rights. So the idea of the story is that it starts in a beginning, or with a beginning. And the story that I tell today starts here in Pennsylvania. So we have the birthplace of our country. Go back in time hundreds of years ago, and we're at the Second Continental Congress on the other side of the state. And there we have our Declaration of Independence. And in that Declaration of Independence, the fathers give the idea of self-evident truths, that there are some rights that are unalienable. And you all know that from studying constitutional law and growing up here in the birthplace of the country, that these rights include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And as time passes, as our notion of what life, of what liberty, of what happiness is, those rights have expanded. And we have our Bill of Rights, we have more amendments, we have the Civil Rights Act, we have women's suffrage, and so on and so on. But now, as we come to this sort of precipice, this looming challenge of climate change and the threat to human survival, we come to other questions of what rights are important, what are fundamental, and what are important to life and liberty and the pursuit of our happiness. And those rights, I would put to you, include not only the right to a clean environment, but tied hand in hand, the right to energy, a human right to energy. So this story also now, as we start in Pennsylvania, I'm going to move on to another topic of discussion that we had last night at dinner, and that was Little House on the Prairie. Another story of commuting, of migration, of journey. And so here we've got Ma and Pa Ingalls leaving Wisconsin in the covered wagon, journeying across, and I looked this up on Google Maps, 685 miles to Independence, Kansas. Now, I used to drive from Kansas to Minneapolis when I lived in Kansas and my parents were in Minneapolis, and it took 7 hours. 7 hours, stop maybe at the bridges of Madison County in Iowa for McDonald's, and then move on. But for Ma and Pa Ingalls, children could be born, states could be brought in, things could be happening in Washington, D.C. that you would never hear about unless some neighbor came to you with news that had been brought in by a newly patched in piece of the railroad. And they go off, and in that sort of forming of the American West, of the expansion that sort of makes this country what it is, here we have the story of an American family that go off without a car, without any sort of mode of automated transportation. They go out, settle in places where there isn't a Home Depot. There's no place to get supplies. So Ma goes out with the children to collect firewood for heat and to cook. And they use these biofuels as the main source, the only source of heat for the home and for food. And Pa goes out to forage for materials to build the home. And it's all hand-hewed, and he lays them out. And there, any drafts that come in, I mean, wood is not a perfectly sealed material, so they're covered with chinks of mud, with straw. And so it's cold. But that was the expectation at the time. That was what housing was. That was how you cooked your food. That was how you kept warm. For women, when you had children, you had them at the home without access to medical attention or for hospitals. And so accordingly, we have life expectancy that's low. We have all of these things, these outcomes that we value now: warmth, heat, life, high life expectancy. We take them for granted now, but people had a different sort of expectation at the time. So this human right to energy starts with a sort of conversation about what is energy poverty. And energy poverty can also mean energy insecurity. And I'll talk about both things. The other is, what is this energy human right? What is the concept of it? And then, of course, barriers to it, which we'll talk about in our panels throughout the day on environmental justice, on regulation, security of water, access. All of these are tied together with some of these challenges to a comprehensive energy development. So infrastructure, funding, sustainability, resiliency kind of go hand in hand with climate change. Now, I do have a section here called solutions, because that's always nice to have in a presentation, and we'll talk about those solutions at the end. So I'm going to start here, since we're in shale country, and I love this map. This is the picture that some of you might recognize. It was about a decade earlier. It's the Bakken Shale picture, and it talks about natural gas flaring. So when natural gas is produced through hydraulic fracturing, you have vast quantities that come up through the flowback. So hydraulic fracturing involves water that's being pumped subsurface. That water causes fractures along with some proppant. Now, that water has to be flowed back. The Bakken is mostly oil. In the flowback process, there's methane, the sort of main component of natural gas that comes back through the flowback. That either has to be captured, it's a saleable product after all, and put into a pipeline and moved, because it's gaseous molecules. We can't put it into a tank at an economic price. And so we either have to capture it and transport it, or we have to flare it. If there isn't pipeline infrastructure, midstream infrastructure, if we don't have those in place, it's flared. And so this chart came up with the idea that you could see the Bakken field in North Dakota from space because of the flares, the drilling, the rig lights, the things that operate and take and are necessary for energy production. Now, this was probably at maybe the sort of the origin of the shale gas revolution. And that has culminated in the United States being the largest oil and gas producer in the world. This is something that presidential administrations, academics, politicians, nobody thought this was possible. This was sort of Nixon's dream, along with probably not getting impeached, but that's another story. But this dream of American energy independence, this is because of this birthplace of oil, of coal, of iron here in Steel City, or on the plains of North Dakota, or on the Great Plains of the Dakotas, Kansas, Colorado, Texas, all the way down. But this is also a beautiful graph because it shows electricity. So from space, what does our American night sky look like? And here it is lit up with the beauty of power and of electricity. And we take this for granted. Now, in our western half of the United States, we could make the assumption that maybe the western half of the United States is not electrified. Here, it's because our populations are concentrated in these sort of major populations east. and in then certain areas along the west. But in other places around the world, that's not the case. The reason for the lack of lights, the reason for the lack of the sort of electrification is because there isn't access to electricity. So either no access to electricity or insufficient or unreliable access, which is the energy insecurity issue. So in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Southeast Asia, we have no access to electricity. And in some countries, and some are absolutely so surprising, so in some countries, and I have just a few examples here, in Angola, we have 60% of the population has no electricity. In Bangladesh, in Asia, 75 or 25% has no access. And then we come back to sort of sub-Saharan Africa, Botswana, 40% of the population without access, and so on and so on. But the two examples that I bring up as no access to electricity, which are incredibly surprising, are Ghana and Nigeria. And these are incredibly, Angola along with them, incredibly oil-rich countries. And for those of you that have already taken the energy law courses or natural resources law courses, you know that we study this called the resource curse. The idea that there is one natural resource, usually mining, minerals, oil and gas, that a country becomes so dependent on that no other industries are developed. That is usually hand in hand with political failing, political infrastructure failure, lack of civic electoral process, and also corruption. And if any of you are following what is happening in Venezuela right now, then that is an incredible sort of example of the resource curse at work. So here in these countries, there's a beautiful documentary on Netflix called Big Men, which is about a Dallas oil and gas company, an independent that goes out to discover the greatest offshore discovery, sort of one of the great offshore discoveries in West Africa, that talks about Ghana wanting to avoid the resource curse and looking to the Norwegian model. We look to the Norwegian model as the way of taking natural resources and investing back into the country with the use of sovereign wealth funds or other sort of give back mechanisms. So we have so many countries here which do not have access that the number is staggering. In 2019, we have 1.3 billion people who don't have access to electricity. So thinking back to Ma and Pa Ingalls in the 1800s, 200 years ago, not having access to electricity, and how far we've come, where now we're launching mannequins into space with the hopes of starting space tourism. And here you have 1.3 billion people in the world who don't have a light switch to turn on in their homes. So this energy poverty, this is the problem that we face along with climate change to some extent. And by that I mean it's so great a problem. It is so large a challenge. It is existential in nature, unable for small groups of populations, and we involved in these small social structures to realize immediate harm, immediate impact. It's going to be cold. There's a tornado. There's drought. Something is happening right now. We've evolved as a species to react to local, regional, immediate concerns that these problems of people so far away, of climate, of catastrophe that can happen maybe not in our lifetime, but we see that it is happening in our lifetime. It's hard to get our arms around the solution. And again, I'm going to sort of think about this for the solutions. So here we have the impacts of energy poverty, of education, children being unable to study, of families having to crowd around one small source of heat then, or one small source of light. The cook stove problem is something that scholars have researched and are continuing to research on, and the Gates Foundations, the Clinton Foundations, there's a lot of investment that is going on into the idea of cook stoves. So much of the world, about 3 billion people, still use biofuel, biomass, wood, animal dung, sometimes charcoal, to cook in the homes. the homes are not ventilated. So unlike Ma and Pa Ingalls cooking out in Independence, Kansas, out in the open air, these are people cooking within their shelters. And for any of you who love architectural design and the beautiful sort of historic district and the homes that the students pointed out on our way here, you'll notice homes along the 1800s, early 1900s, the grand homes, and even the sort of smaller homes have very high ceilings. Because when coal was discovered at the Industrial Revolution and homes turned to heat their homes, not using wood but using coal, the amount of smoke, and it's a very sort of, it doesn't capture all of the energy released, and so it's not as efficient as other methods for heat, and so you have coal smoke and soot. And the idea of it hanging low over cities, hanging low over Pittsburgh in the age of steel, hanging low over these homes in the 1800s, you needed vaulted ceilings so the smoke would rise up, and so that you didn't have to wallow around in your home in coal smoke and soot. So the idea here of women, and it's women who are traditionally bearing the disproportionate exposure to cook stove, it's through the lack of sort of liquefied petroleum gas, propane. And so moving to liquefied petroleum gas can take sort of women and increase life expectancies when they're cooking and they've got small infants. The infants, the children, the people who remain in the homes are also exposed to this. So that switch from using coal, from using animal dung, from using things that are inefficiently burned, harmful to human health, and moving to liquefied petroleum gas and other sort of more efficient and more safe methods, that's life-changing. That is absolutely life-changing. And so it's incredible. I mean, the thing about putting pictures here is it makes people relatable. Because if I was just to tell you that 4,000 people a day die from exposure to cook stoves over long-term either health risks, asthma, small sort of birth defects, that's hard for us to get our hands around. More people than die of HIV, of malaria, and tuberculosis. So energy poverty here and the shift to other fuels, which are not only renewables, but in all of the above energy portfolio, it's important and it's life-changing. The gathering of fuels, too, is not only hazardous to health, but you think about time away from productivity of a country. So if I have 50% of my population and they have to go out and they have to find biomass to burn every day, and I'm pulling women out of the education system, out of the workplace, what am I doing to my productivity? So the impacts then, and the United Nations has identified this in their Sustainable Development Goals, they go out beyond. And that's what's so beautiful about the panels, the conversations, the dialogues you're going to hear today. They touch on this beautiful nexus of water, of environment, of social justice, environmental justice, and energy, because it is all sort of one thing. So water poverty is another issue that comes up, and I know we've got a panel that's going to discuss this and sort of the technologies that are being implemented. But water poverty, food poverty, energy, and climate are all part of the same system. And it's important then to go back to this idea of existentialism, that we no longer view things as disparate or discrete, that we look at them as a network, as systematic, and be able to address things on a whole. The social poverty, too, is really critical here because finding water, finding fuels disproportionately impacts women. So not only are we, and young girls, so not only are we pulling them out of the workforce, we're pulling them out of the entire educational system. And anyone that has studied poverty knows then that this becomes a cycle of poverty that's very difficult to break. So now our story comes home because poverty isn't just abroad. And so the idea then that it's somewhere far away, it's some time long ago, or it's something I can't really fathom, the important thing to remember about energy poverty is that it doesn't discriminate. There are no borders for poverty. And so here we have a scene, and it's of a young boy. It's a documentary that was done about American rural poverty. And it's a young boy sitting in his uncle's cabin. And this is out in Kentucky. It's one of the poorest counties in the country. And there's no electricity, there's no running water, and you see a stove, a cook stove. Here you see how the family cooks, how the family keeps warm. And you see the pile of wood beside that stove to burn. And there's our young child, there's our young American. So it's happening here, especially for those of you that are interested in indigenous people and native populations, particularly in Oklahoma, where we have a large kind of focus on this program. In native populations in Indian country, the rates of poverty far outstrip those of tribal lands. And so here, this is the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. This is part of the Ogallala sort of branch of the Sioux people. And here we have, again, one of the poorest counties in the country where people do not have access to electricity. And so we are reliant again, just as 1.3 billion people are reliant on using biomass to heat homes. And this picture was just taken in 2016 or 2017. So this is absolutely astonishing that we are still living in this age and we still have fellow Americans who don't have access to electricity. So and that's a picture of the home too. And so the idea of poverty is that energy is critical, but also it impacts housing, it impacts health, etc. Now, American energy insecurity is also global, but the idea of energy insecurity is that we don't have reliable access. We may not have resilient access, and we'll look at Puerto Rico a little bit later on to talk about resiliency and how that is an important challenge. This is a picture from Pittsburgh. So one of the programs that's done here in Pittsburgh is there's sort of a conservation group that goes out and performs energy audits. And so for populations that can't afford payment for utilities, they can call the sort of nonprofits and have them conduct an energy audit. The energy audit is you need more insulation here, there's all these sort of leaks here, and the idea of this energy insecurity and why the poor disproportionately pay far more in energy costs than the average American or those Americans in high income levels is because they can only afford to live in usually old homes that are inefficient, that don't have sort of central heating or central air conditioning in the South. People dying in the summer from heat is a large problem. And so they can't afford this. Their power plans might be those that are subsidized by the electric power grids or electric power utilities rather, or pay as you go. So think about pay as you go. So I like a sofa at Macy's and I have a down payment. I have a pay-as-you-go plan for a sofa. Imagine pay-as-you-go for a cell phone. That's okay. We think about pay-as-you-go, even though arguably cell phones are becoming a necessity for populations. But think about pay-as-you-go power. Think of pay-as-you-go heat outside right now. I only have $15 left in my account. I can't afford to pay anymore. What am I going to do? So the idea of what is energy security and what is energy poverty is usually the definition is more than 1/3 of your household income is devoted to gas and to power. And so that's for heating and air conditioning purposes. So over 1/3. It usually means that you are making choices on a daily basis or monthly basis about food, eat, or gas, heat. So it's the heat or eat problem, or medications, or hospitals, doctor treatments. Making those decisions is just, it's really incomprehensible. So we have the Energy Information Administration recently conducted a survey and found that about 25 million American households are in energy poverty, and that about 7 million of them each month have to make a decision about whether they're going to pay the power bill or they're going to eat. Every month. And 2 million households are getting disconnection notices from the power company every month. That we have so many of our citizens, of our families, of our communities living like this really goes to show you this isn't a problem that is someone else's far away, some person so far and so remote that I can't identify them, that it's neighbors, that it's here in Pittsburgh, and this is from the Post-Gazette. But the idea of 211 calls for United Way, and I apologize for the small print here. But the idea here that there are certain neighborhoods within Pittsburgh that have made so many calls, and the most are for electric service payment assistance. So 10,000, almost 10,000 calls or 9,000 calls made for help with power. Second is taxes. I'm not here to talk about taxes unless we're going to talk about a carbon tax, and guaranteed we're going to talk about a carbon tax. So, and then third is for gas service. So here in Pittsburgh, in these communities highlighted that you are likely more familiar with than I am, here we have our own citizenry needing help and asking for help. So what is then this sort of human right to energy? So we go from the Constitution, the idea of enshrined rights that are so fundamental and so foundational that we incorporated them as part of our birth certificate, here to the United Nations and the Declaration of Human Rights, which has been expanded upon. And so we have this expansion of social rights that have been added. And along the way, we also have this idea of the Sustainable Development Goals that have been promulgated by the United Nations. And what the United Nations have said is, let's devote money to poverty and fight poverty. And poverty includes, and the solution includes, again, this universal right to energy, a human right to energy. So, okay, that's good. Now we're going to get into this idea of, well, it sounds like the solution is we just electrify the world, right? That's the solution. But there are so many challenges when it comes to this. So the idea of these development challenges, the first is we really don't have many ways to transmit electricity. So I have generation, I have this, well, first I have a source supply. So we have either shale gas that we burn, and that burning creates heat, which turns a turbine, which creates power. Or we have wind power, which turns the turbine, which creates power. Or we have, whatever it does, something is turning a turbine to create power. And then what we know is we transmit electricity along wires. And that's inefficient. There's electrical loss, line loss that happens. So we don't create and capture all of the electricity that we generate at a source. But our minds, or the ways that we think right now for electrical infrastructure, is you need a source, you need generation of the power, that turbine, you need long sort of distance transmission, and then I need local distribution. And we pay for all of that using utilities, using this idea of pass-through pricing, pass-through mechanism. That's what we know here. But obviously, that might not work all the way around the world. So how do we bring in this concept of what we know works might not work well, and how do we make or create new models to address other locales where this model may not work? So this is, again, the challenge of this development. You can see it's very linear. So what I would put to you, especially for the students, is you need to think not out of the box, but out of the line. How do you go from a two-dimensional system into something that is more living and more organic? That's the challenge for energy and to address energy poverty. So here what we have, and sometimes this is where we can tie hand in hand with not moving to a purely 100% renewable energy, but an all of the above flexible, adaptable portfolio where we still include hydrocarbons, mainly natural gas for electric power generation and moving away from coal, but in some cases it might be good to have some coal, but also nuclear power in addition to moving towards renewables, which will be the future of energy. energy evolves, renewables are part of that evolution. But in the progression along that evolution, we still need this adaptable portfolio. And so what countries are doing globally is that if I'm an international oil company and I go to the national oil company and I ask for a concession or I ask for a license to produce, what the national oil company is saying, what the ministry is asking for, the host government, you need to provide electrification. Now, that's another conversation for those of you that go on to represent corporations, is now corporations sort of carrying an economic burden that goes far beyond just the cost of development and production, but that goes to sort of the idea of the social license to operate, which is becoming more and more a theme in the extractive industries. So something to think about. Do we have a duty to do this? And not a fiduciary legal duty, but a moral duty. And so that is the idea of sustainable development, working hand in hand with extraction and industry to address some of these challenges so that we're not relying completely on nonprofits. But also, it's becoming a cost of doing business, where the host government, in order to get the concession or in order to get the license or to award the bid to somebody, looks at what are you going to provide for my people, for my citizenry, for my populations that lack access to power. The other thing, you can't talk about any of this without it talking about money. So the idea about the money is, where does this money come from? So we have this funding gap, and again, these new mechanisms of finding ways to address old problems, microfinance, these sort of micro loans that are being made, in addition to sort of the traditional nonprofit mechanisms. But this is where I think you really have to talk about the carbon tax. And again, the political conversation, or rather the electoral population, people don't want to pay tax. But at some point in time, in order to address climate change, to address energy poverty, address our consumption of energy, we have to think about these solutions. And so the idea of why the Green New Deal, which I'm not focusing on the Green New Deal here, but the Green New Deal, it puts into perspective an ideology, a promise, the idea of American greatness again, our sort of moon launch project, without talking about carbon taxes. Because former Secretary James Baker and his sort of climate leadership council, people have tried to have this conversation again and again. And economists will tell you, if you want to reduce demand, then increase cost. But what do you do when the political obstacles to these just don't allow you to do this? So we sort of set our sights maybe on something greater. But here, carbon tax would be a way to pay for this infrastructure, a way to pay for access to energy and to subsidize sort of forms to populations in need. Development challenges, though, bring into the sort of conversation the idea of resiliency and how, as climate threats, as they become more and more prevalent, the idea here is, are we building infrastructure? Is our current infrastructure, is it sufficient? So here is Puerto Rico. So this is after the hurricane 2017, and here we have not the generation, not the power plants that were affected, it was the transmission and distribution system over mountains, long areas, and so this is what took almost a year to restore, and in some parts of Puerto Rico is still under restoration. So here we go, back in time, to the idea of Little House on the Prairie. When I don't have electric power, we have again citizens of our country washing their clothes in the water, taking their clothes down and doing laundry here, standing in line for propane to heat their homes, to cook on. So this happened 2 years ago. So the idea then that Puerto Rico really talked about is, are we developing, do we have a system that we won't just replace with the same old two-dimensional linear line of thinking, but is there something more that we can do that brings in renewable energy, that brings in LNG, liquefied natural gas, and allows us to combine these in addition to other things like even rethinking our public utility structure. Now, the public utility structure, this is something that we need to really be thoughtful about, because the way in America that we address sort of populations who can't afford power, we subsidize it through the pool. So if everybody, the utility company goes out and I have massive infrastructure, so I have to pay, and I have sort of a regulated rate of return I'm allowed to make on my infrastructure and my utility structure. In order to do that, I can buy power, large purchases of power, 30-year long-term contracts, and then I can take what I save in those long-term power contracts, and I can use those savings to subsidize low-income populations. And that goes back to the Pittsburgh slide. That's where we get money to do things. But what happens as we motivate people to do microgrids, to do distributive generation, which is I put solar panels on my house, I maybe get a tax credit to do so, it's advantageous for me, and I remove my demand from the grid. And as more and more people remove their demand for the grid, the utility rate cost remains the same, which means the people who stay behind now have to pay more. And if I have to pay more for my power, well, that just incentivizes me to pull out of the grid and look for my own sources. And again, what happens to those disadvantaged populations who are reliant on the power of mass purchase? So just making sure that we think about this with respect to the conversations that you will hear starting today at this wonderful, beautiful colloquium on water and climate and energy and justice, that I would put to you that some of these solutions that I've talked about, and even not some of the ones at the bottom, like capacity and the technologic, what the economists sort of call the wizard solutions, right? Something magical will happen. The sorting hat will figure it all out for us. Not so. It will be you. It will be your generation, you as lawyers, as negotiators, representatives of these low-income households, of these American citizens and your fellow global citizens that will have the solution. So thank you very much.
Not so fast.
I was in such a hurry to finish on time.
No, I'd just like to say that now we all know, you all know what I already did and what Professor Galperin did, that Professor Ehrman is really one of the top law professors in the world. And so I've asked her to take some questions. So we have a microphone. If anybody has questions, just raise your hand.
Professor Abbott didn't mean the world. He probably meant Oklahoma, but even Oklahoma, that would be nice.
We'll say world.
I'll start since I didn't see any other hands, even though I get lots of opportunity to talk today. So among your policy solutions was the carbon tax. What do you think about alternative policy solutions, whether it's cap and trade or a more command and control structure? What are among the various policy solutions? You seem to prefer the tax, but are there others that you think would be valuable?
Yeah, I mean, Professor Galperin, that's such a good question. You know, the problem is cap and trade makes sense. Carbon taxes make sense, and there are countries like Canada, like most of the EU, where we have these sort of carbon tax or credit emissions trading systems in place, and it seems to work, obviously, in political systems where there's more control at the federal government level. And here, we don't have that political infrastructure in place. We have a lot of power that resides in the state level. And so in order to get the sort of consensus around that, we just need more political and electoral, like civic participation, and we don't have that. So I think, yes, the answer is all of that, yes. Like we need, I mean, as a Canadian, I'm a big fan of command and control and taxes, but I don't know, and I think that legislators too, we don't know if that will happen in the United States at this time, which is why I think visions like the Green New Deal, which instead of saying, we will, and again, I think I'm talking about it as an idea. I'm not incredibly familiar with the specifics of it. But the idea of it is that we don't use the word tax. We don't use the word fee. So here, the promise is jobs, right? A job for every citizen so that nobody is left out of the green economy. Now, whether that's viable or not, I mean, that's the problem here, because in West Virginia, with the pullout of coal, and we had, and this was after the, mountaintop mining was an issue, and you yourself, when you were at Yale, had one of the Goldman Environmental Prize winners who talked about mountaintop mining. And but here, what we've got are the promise of new jobs, but the idea of where are these jobs coming from? That we can't site wind farms economically on top of mountains. That's why they are in Oklahoma and Kansas and the Dakotas along these great swaths of plain. And so our generation source is not where our populations that need jobs. And so the idea of what works, I think realistically, we would need to address all of that. Politically, I don't know if any of that is feasible here.
Thank you. It was a really interesting talk. I was interested when you first introduced your agenda, you had the things that you talked about as solutions as barriers to energy development and reducing energy poverty. And I'm wondering, after listening to some of the things that you identify as solutions, could you change that label to enablers? Because they seem, in your presentation, to come across as catalysts for innovation, for ways to think about how do we eliminate energy poverty or mobility poverty or whatever label you want to put on the gap. So it might just sound like semantics, but I think that if the ending point is there are a lot of things that we can do if we enable people to be innovative, that often starts with reframing the issue. So I'd be curious about your thoughts about that.
That is a really interesting observation. The idea here is that it's really cyclical. There isn't an end. It's like the sort of, the sideways eight, the snake eating its own tail, right, for infinity. There isn't an end and there isn't a beginning to the solution. And so even though I start with this is a story that's an old story and has no end. So I think you properly identify that what we think of as the problems, right? So maybe our linear way of thinking, this no access to infrastructure, gender disparity, sort of, racial disparity, low income problems. There isn't a solution that fits all of these things. That we need to think about energy poverty at the same time that we think about water poverty and food poverty, and that the problems then that you identify also become our saviors. So looking at infrastructure. Well, just because infrastructure means that some communities or some countries are unable to implement it right away, maybe we can think about different forms of infrastructure, and that includes political infrastructure, back to Professor Galperin's question. So along the Arctic communities, there's a big problem of electrification. And so the idea is that most of these communities in Alaska, in the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Canada, we don't have sort of reliant access, and these are parts of Alaska, not the cities, but we don't have access to energy. And so we know how to get it. We put it on a barge, we take heating oil, we send it up there, we burn heating oil. But thinking about infrastructure in new and novel ways, well, let's put wind farms up there. And so being more reliant, not on solar, which might not work there 6 months of the year, but on wind. And also using like Alaska Native corporations, like using these sort of tribal community and local government structures. So taking what we know about politics and infrastructure, but also seeing solutions within them. I don't think I've really addressed your question very well. It's a really good observation.
Hi, thank you very much. So we heard you mention power generators, and we heard you mention utilities. I'm hoping to get your thoughts on third-party suppliers and how they fit into this framework, if at all.
Yeah, are you talking about like private companies, like private entrance into the market? Like non-utility?
Right, so I'm talking like the Green Mountain Energy or, NextEra, anything, those sorts of third-party suppliers. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how it fits into your presentation, if at all.
Yeah, I mean, that goes to the bigger picture of sort of electricity and deregulation, right? So once we have the sort of deregulation and open access to markets, and this happened first in power and then in natural gas, we see more and more entrants into the marketplace who want to take advantage of this. The idea then of incentivizing or asking these third-party producers to come in, compete for business, which that competition should then lower prices, right, sort of theoretically lower prices, that's always dependent on there being an ability to make money for those entrants. And the other thing that it's sort of is a requisite is there has to be some sort of niche in order for that competitor, that new entrant, to come in and survive. And so the idea is there an economic solution or sort of an economic motivator for like the new entrants to come in and address these poverty solutions? Can we make money at the same time that we help people? So it's a really good question. I think as you sort of, I mean, that goes, I think what we're seeing now is maybe a trend towards technology. So not just power suppliers, because Green Mountain is an example of a company, and what Green Mountain will do is they will go out and they will buy power. And Green Mountain will do its best to buy power that comes from wind or renewable sources, but it doesn't do that all the time, because sometimes it just needs power. And electrons, like natural gas molecules, are commingleable. So I can commingle everything. And they're fugacious, they just sort of move around. So if I have an electron, I'm not really always quite sure on the grid if that came from a wind farm or if it came from burning coal. I can't tell. So Green Mountain's a great example, but they've gone out to, and they'll buy power from wherever they need to buy power. They try to always buy power from renewable sources. It doesn't always work. So the idea then is maybe not looking so much as to entrance into the public utility or electrification space, but the technology space. And there's some brilliant work that's being done at Harvard and MIT and all around the country by students, just like yourselves, graduate students, and for the adults in the room, for the adults too, it's being done by everybody. And, but the idea here is looking at how do we just transform energy, period. So using kinetic energy. So I can't remember the name of the project, but a soccer ball that kids kick around, it stores that kinetic energy and then transforms kinetic energy into light. So you can hang that little soccer ball, and the soccer ball kind of produces light at night. So, and I might not be, that might be just a capacity device. But the idea is I take kinetic energy from motion, from the kicking of a soccer ball, and I use it to generate light at night. So I think that's where you're going to see more of these new entrants into the marketplace, is those that are thinking about energy greater than just sort of electric power, but looking at transformation of energy sources from the generating side.
So I'm going to have to cut it off here so we can sort of stay on schedule and get our next panel to come up. But thank you very much.